The vote lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes to decide the fate of an entire species, and not a single delegate asked for more time. That was perhaps the most damning thing about it. Not the cruelty, not the arrogance, but the sheer speed of the indifference. The galactic convergence, 412 civilizations, spanning two-thirds of the known galaxy, governing trade routes older than humanity's first cities, had been monitoring the third planet of the Sol system for roughly 200 years by then. They had been watching since the first radio signals leaked out into space like a slow bleed. Chaotic, overlapping, full of static and war communiques and strange musical broadcasts, and the recorded screams of dying men on distant battlefields. The report submitted to the High Council by Chief Observer Don Vorth was thorough, 60 pages. She had spent 4 years writing it. The species, she noted, called themselves humans. They occupied a single pale blue world with one large moon. They had not yet split the atom, though they were close. They warred constantly, across every continent, over resources, ideology, borders, gods. Their population was growing faster than their technology could sustainably support. Their seas were warming. Their forests were vanishing. Several of their largest nations were in possession of enough explosive yield to render the planet's surface uninhabitable. Don Vorth had also noted, buried in Appendix C, which nobody read, that the species had produced something unusual: art. Not the ritualistic markings of a presentient creature, but genuine, deliberate, self-aware expression. Literature, music, philosophy. A being on a continent called Europe had, just 30 of their years prior, written a piece of music so structurally perfect that Don Vorth had included the notation in the appendix. She was not a musician. She had included it anyway, because it had made her feel something she could not name. Nobody asked about Appendix C. The delegate from the Therlian Dominion spoke first. He said the humans were a presapient anomaly, a phrase he had clearly prepared in advance, which meant he had made up his mind before the report was even distributed. He recommended immediate quarantine protocol 7, a full exclusion zone around the solar system, automated monitoring buoys at the boundary, and a standing order that no convergence vessel approach, communicate with, or acknowledge the species until they had demonstrated the capacity for peaceful self-governance across a sustained period of not less than 500 years. 3 delegates seconded. One asked if 500 was sufficient. Someone else suggested 1,000 just to be safe. The motion passed 401 to 11. The 11 dissenters included Don Vorth, who had no voting power but submitted a formal objection anyway. It was logged, filed, and never retrieved. The buoys went up within 2 of Earth's years, silent, dark, nearly invisible, sitting at the edge of the solar system like a fence around a yard with a dangerous dog. The convergence moved on. There were trade disputes to settle, wars to mediate between civilizations that actually mattered, infrastructure projects spanning stellar distances. Earth was a footnote, a problem shelved, a thing to be checked on in a century or so, when perhaps it had solved itself one way or another. What nobody in that chamber, not Don Vorth, not the Therlian delegate, not the 11 who voted against, considered was this: they were not quarantining a sick patient until it recovered. They were quarantining a crucible until it reached temperature. On Earth, the silence from the stars was noted. Scientists pointed their instruments outward and found nothing looking back. Philosophers wrote about the loneliness of the cosmos. Theologians argued about what it meant. Children grew up learning that humanity was, in all likelihood, alone. And then they got back to work. Because that was the thing about humans. Tell them the universe doesn't care about them, and they will spend every waking hour proving the universe wrong. The first interstellar probe launched 3 years after the vote, aimed at nothing in particular, carrying a golden record of sounds and music and mathematics. It crossed the quarantine boundary on a Tuesday. The buoy logged it, flagged it, and sent a report to an archive that nobody had checked in 160 years. They almost didn't make it, several times. The first close call came roughly 80 years after the quarantine was established. Humanity, still unaware of the fence around its yard, nearly burned the house down from the inside. Two great powers, each armed with enough nuclear warheads to fracture the planet's crust, came within 4 minutes of mutual annihilation. A single man, sitting alone in a Soviet monitoring station in the Ural Mountains, watched a screen tell him 5 missiles were inbound. Protocol was clear. He was supposed to report it up the chain. He was supposed to start the clock. His name was Stanislav Petrov. He decided, alone in the dark, that it was a false alarm. He had no proof. He had instinct and doubt and the peculiar human capacity to hesitate at the edge of catastrophe and ask, "But what if I'm wrong?" He was right, it was a sensor error. The missiles did not exist. He was reprimanded for not following protocol. Humanity moved on. Then came the warming, decades of rising seas and dying reefs and failed harvests and climate refugees numbering in the millions, then tens of millions. The Convergence Observer vessel stationed at the boundary, running routine passive scans, dutifully logged the atmospheric carbon levels, the average surface temperature increases, the coastal city flooding. The current observer, a young methodical creature named Pelinath, filed a report titled Projected Extinction Timeline, Sol III, Humans, and gave it a 90% probability of species collapse within 200 years. She filed it, she moved on. There were other systems to monitor. What Pelinath did not account for, what none of them ever accounted for, was the human response to catastrophe. Humans did not accept extinction timelines. They treated them as engineering problems. Within 50 years, the largest energy infrastructure project in human history had restructured the planet's power grid. Fusion reactors, stumbled upon through a cascade of failed experiments, and one memorable accident in which a lab in France accidentally superheated a room full of very expensive equipment, and also, incidentally, discovered the key to sustainable fusion, began coming online across every continent. Carbon drawdown technology, initially laughed out of funding committees, became standard infrastructure. The seas stabilized, not fully, not without scarring, but they stabilized. Pelinath updated her report, 70%, then 40%. Then she stopped filing extinction timelines altogether because the numbers kept embarrassing her. Meanwhile, in the silence of a galaxy that had forgotten them, humans looked outward. The first generation ships launched in what humans call the 23rd century, enormous, slow, magnificent things, carrying 50,000 people each into the dark between stars. They didn't have faster-than-light travel. They didn't wait for it. They built ships that could sustain life across centuries, and they climbed in. Children born on those ships never saw Earth. They were born among the stars, and they grew up understanding, bone deep, that the universe did not owe them anything, that every breath of recycled air, every calorie of hydroponic food, every lumen of artificial light was something humans had built for themselves. Those children were different, not superhuman, not augmented beyond recognition, just shaped by the understanding that survival was a choice you made every single day. By the time the first-generation ships reached neighboring star systems and began the brutal, methodical work of terraforming, cracking ice moons for water, seeding atmospheres with engineered bacteria, building magnetic shields from scratch on dead worlds, the Convergence had not thought about Earth in over 3 centuries. 16 planets, 2 solar systems, 46 billion people. 12 artificial intelligences, each with distinct culture and philosophy, each a civilization unto themselves that chose to remain in partnership with humanity rather than apart from it. A fleet of 2,000 vessels ranging from mining drones to kilometer-long carriers. And not a single piece of technology borrowed, gifted, or inherited from anyone else in the universe. Every bit of it was theirs, invented in cramped labs, tested in disasters, refined across generations, paid for in lives and years, and the specific human currency of refusing to stop trying. In a Convergence archive, untouched since it was filed, Don Vorth's objection sat in the dark. Appendix C, the music was still there. Velsarith had been assigned the Sol system census update because nobody else wanted it. It was the administrative equivalent of being handed a broom and pointed at an empty corridor, a task so routine, so thoroughly unimportant, that it was given to the most junior archivist in the department as a way of filling her hours. The quarantine zones updated on a 1,000-year cycle. Sol was due. It would take an afternoon. She would file the report, the system would log it, and that would be the end of it. She ran the initial scan from her desk, a small, cluttered workspace in the lower levels of Convergence Hall, surrounded by data tablets and cooling cups of something vaguely like tea. The scan would take 3 minutes. She started it. She went to refill her drink. She came back. She looked at the screen. She sat down very slowly. The preliminary figures were wrong. They had to be. The sensor array must have picked up interference from a nearby system, or there was a calibration error, something, anything, because what she was reading was not possible. The quarantine zone was supposed to contain a pre-industrial species on a single inhabited world, possibly in the process of self-destructing. That was the model. That was what 1,000 years of dormant monitoring suggested. The screen showed 16 inhabited worlds, 2 star systems under human administration, a fleet signature that the analysis software initially tried to classify as a small nation-state, and then quietly reclassified as a mid-tier galactic power, because the first classification made the software look broken. She ran the scan again. Same results. She ran it a third time with a different sensor array, pulling from 3 independent convergence relay stations, triangulating across half a light-year of space. Same results. Over the next 3 weeks, Velsarith did something that no convergence archivist assigned to a routine census update had ever done before. She read everything. Every report ever filed on Sol III, going back to the original Don Vorth submission. The observer logs, the atmospheric data, the extinction projections that kept getting quietly revised downward. The notes from the 14 different observers who had cycled through the boundary posting over the centuries, most of whom had found humanity boring, and said so in their official reports. She read Appendix C. She didn't know what the notation meant. She was not a musician, but she cross-referenced it with the Convergence's xenocultural database and found that the same mathematical structures appeared in 3 other species' most sophisticated acoustic traditions, all of them civilizations with thousands of years of history. Earth had produced that in its first few thousand years of organized culture. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went to her superior, a tired administrator named Seth Moron, who had been managing quarantine zone updates for 60 years and had the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from 60 years of nothing ever being interesting. She put the report on his desk. He looked at it for 30 seconds. He told her the sensor array in the outer Sol monitoring grid had always been unreliable. He told her to file a standard census update with the note data anomaly, recommend recalibration, and move on to the next system. She said, "Sir, I used 3 independent arrays." He told her to use the recommended language and close the file. She left his office. She did not close the file. Instead, she did something that would later get her summoned before a disciplinary panel, which would later get dismissed, which would later become a footnote in history books that schoolchildren across 40 civilizations would read. She reached out, through private channels, to a retired Convergence fleet admiral named Torres Vel, a decorated strategist, a famously cautious individual, a being who had not made an unguarded statement in 30 years of public life. She sent him the data, just the data, no commentary, no request, just the numbers. His response came back in 4 hours. 11 words in the most formal register of Convergence standard, the kind of language used for treaty documents and declarations of war. Delete this file, purge the arrays, do not contact me again. Velsarith read it 3 times. She thought about Don Vorth's objection, which she had found in the archive during her research, filed, logged, ignored. She thought about the music in Appendix C. She did not delete the file. She made 6 copies. Captain Amara Osa had spent 22 years in the Earth Interstellar Fleet and had never once encountered another intelligent species. Nobody had. That was simply the reality humanity had accepted, not with despair, but with the particular pragmatic shrug of a civilization that had long since decided that if the universe wasn't going to offer it anything, it would build what it needed itself. The prevailing scientific consensus was that intelligent life was extraordinarily rare, possibly unique to Earth, and that the silence of the cosmos was simply the cosmos being honest about that fact. She found the buoys on a Thursday. Day 19 of the ESV Endurance's deep-range survey mission, 3 light-years past the furthest any human vessel had previously traveled, in a region of space that every long-range scan suggested was completely empty. The buoys were old, elegant in the way that truly old technology is elegant, stripped of everything unnecessary, built to last rather than to impress. There were 47 of them, spaced at precise intervals in a vast curve that, when the Endurance's navigation system mapped them, formed a perfect boundary, a line clearly intentional that someone had drawn around the solar system a very long time ago. They were broadcasting a signal. Commander Chen Liang, the ship's chief linguist, had the signal isolated and running through analysis software within the hour. He was smiling within 6 hours, laughing within 12. Not because it was funny, because the mathematics were beautiful, and mathematically beautiful things made Chen Liang laugh the way other people laughed at jokes. "It's a lock," he told Osei. "A very old, very elegant lock, with the key built right into it if you know how to look. 11 days. 11 days to crack 60% of a language that no human had ever heard, in a script no human had ever seen, built on logic structures that turned out to be, in their foundations, underneath all the alien syntax, not entirely unlike the deep grammar of half a dozen Earth languages. Because mathematics, it turned out, was mathematics everywhere." "What does it say?" Osei asked. Chen Liang cleared his throat. "Broadly, do not cross this line." Osei looked at the buoys on the view screen. Then she looked at her crew, 340 humans, all of them leaning slightly forward in their seats, the way humans always leaned when something interesting was happening. "Send a response," she said. "In their language." In their language. The message they sent was simple. It had taken the senior officers 4 hours to agree on the wording, which had involved 3 separate arguments, 1 very long silence, and finally Commander Chen Liang writing something on a piece of paper, sliding it across the table, and everyone going quiet. 7 words. Translated from Convergent Standard, they meant, "We found your fence. Let's talk." Across the boundary, in a monitoring station that had not been staffed by an organic being in 200 years, an automated system processed the incoming signal, cross-referenced it against the quarantine parameters, flagged it as a Priority 1 breach event, the first such flag in 1,000 years. It sent an alert to Convergence High Command. It sent a copy to the Fleet Admiral's office. It sent a copy because the system was old and its routing logic was outdated, and nobody had bothered to update the distribution list in 3 centuries, to the personal data terminal of one junior archivist named Velsareth, who had at some point been added to the Sol monitoring list as part of her census work and never removed. Velsareth read it at her desk at what was, for her, 2 in the morning. She read it 4 times. Then she leaked it to every major Convergence press outlet simultaneously, from an anonymous terminal in a public library, using a routing method she had taught herself from a very old data security textbook, because she had suspected for 3 weeks that this moment might come, and she had wanted to be ready. By morning, 40 star systems knew that Earth had spoken. The Convergence High Council convened in emergency session 17 hours after the signal was received. They were not afraid. That was the first mistake, and it shaped every decision that followed. Fear, at least, produces caution. What the council felt instead was something far more dangerous: irritation. The kind of irritation a homeowner feels when a problem they thought they dealt with turns up again. A leak that was patched, a crack that was sealed, a species that was supposed to be quietly going extinct behind a fence and instead had somehow shown up at the door and knocked. Delegate Marinsal of the Therlian Dominion, a descendant, in the way that mattered politically, of the delegate who had proposed the quarantine 1,000 years prior, spoke first. He was a large, imperious being with the specific bearing of someone who had never in his life been told he was wrong by anyone whose opinion he respected. "This is a containment failure," he said, "not a first contact event. I want that distinction noted formally in the record." It was noted. Debate lasted 9 hours. 90% of it was procedural theater, delegates positioning themselves, protecting alliances, calculating how to vote in ways that would benefit their home civilizations regardless of what the vote was actually about. 6 delegates argued that humanity should be welcomed immediately, that the quarantine had been wrong from the beginning. They were dismissed with the particular patronizing kindness reserved for people who make correct arguments at inconvenient moments. The resolution that passed was called the Boundary Enforcement Directive. What it meant, stripped of its language: send the military. The Sixth Armada was dispatched within 48 hours. 32 capital ships, 800 fighter-class vessels, support craft, logistics chains, the full architecture of a force that had not fired a shot in anger in over 300 years, because the last civilization to challenge convergence authority had done so briefly and had not done so again. Admiral Keen Voreth, commanding, was briefed on the Sol situation in a 20-minute meeting. He was told it was a single rogue vessel from a precontact species. He was told to return it to the Sol system, re-establish the boundary, and issue a formal containment declaration. He was told to be firm but not provocative. He was not told about Velsareth's census data. Nobody in the briefing room mentioned it, because the officials who knew about it had collectively decided that it was either a censor error or a problem to be dealt with after the vessel was sent home. In the council chamber, the lone dissenting vote, cast by the ancient and rarely speaking Voreth delegate, a being so old that the species' exact age was a matter of convergence historical debate, was recorded without comment. The Voreth delegate, whose name required 17 syllables to pronounce correctly and who preferred to simply be called Oreth, left the chamber without speaking to anyone. A colleague, curious, caught up to ask why he had voted against the directive. Oreth considered the question for a long time, long enough that the colleague began to wonder if the answer was coming at all. "Because," Oreth finally said, in a voice like the distant settling of very old stone, "I ran the predictive model last night, the one my people have been maintaining since the quarantine was established. We update it every century. And..." Oreth looked at the colleague for a moment with an expression that might have been pity, and might have been something older than pity, something that had no precise name in convergence standard. "The last 3 updates have had the same result. The model does not produce a scenario in which the Armada achieves its objective. Not one." A pause. "I voted against because there is no version of the next 72 hours that ends the way Marinsal believes it will." The colleague laughed a little nervously. "Surely you can't believe one vessel." "Go look at the census data," Oreth said quietly. "The actual data, not Seth Moron's summary, the raw numbers." He walked away. The colleague did not go look at the census data because it was late and he had other things to do. He would think about that choice for the rest of his very long life. Admiral Keen Voreth had expected, if he was honest, to feel nothing but boredom. A precontact species in a single vessel, a standard containment, the kind of operation junior officers ran as training exercises. He had dressed for the occasion, full formal uniform, service decorations, the chain of rank that indicated he commanded the 6th largest fleet in convergence history. because it seemed appropriate to look authoritative when delivering an ultimatum to a species that had never met an alien before. He had the Endurance on his view screen when he opened the channel. It was a beautiful ship, actually. He noticed that immediately and noted it with mild surprise. Long and functional, built with a certain aesthetic confidence, clearly designed by beings who understood that a vessel should look like it meant something. He had expected something smaller, cruder. He delivered the containment order in formal convergence standard. Boundary violation confirmed. Return to the Sol system immediately. All further communication to be conducted through official quarantine channels. Noncompliance would result in vessel seizure. He waited. The response came in clear convergence standard, with an accent he had never heard but could understand perfectly, because Chen Liang had by this point achieved 94% language fluency and had spent 3 hours coaching Captain Os on the formal register. Captain Os did not sound afraid. She sounded, if anything, mildly curious. She said she had received the order. She said she had some questions about it. She said she understood there was a governing body involved, and she would appreciate speaking with someone who represented actual decision-making authority, because she didn't want to waste anyone's time. There was a long silence on the Armada's bridge. Keen Vorith's communications officer turned to look at him, with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. The admiral requested to speak with the vessel's commanding officer. He was already speaking to her. He asked if she understood what she was dealing with: 32 capital ships, 800 fighters, the authority of the galactic convergence. She said yes. She could see them on her sensors, and they were impressive. She asked if he would give her 20 minutes. He said yes, because he was curious, and because something in her tone had caused a small, quiet alarm to ring somewhere in his hindbrain. She used 12 of the 20 minutes. She opened a channel to every ship in the Armada simultaneously, something the Armada's communications team confirmed was not supposed to be technically possible from a single vessel, and spoke clearly. She said she represented the Earth Interstellar Fleet, 46 billion humans, 2 solar systems, 16 inhabited worlds. She said she had no desire for conflict. She said she wanted to negotiate an end to what she called, without any particular drama, 1,000 years of rude silence. Then she said the Endurance was going to demonstrate something, not as a threat, as information, so that everyone could make good decisions. The demonstration lasted 90 seconds. The ESV Endurance deployed a targeted electromagnetic pulse, precise as a scalpel, that reached across 60 kilometers of space and shut down every system on the convergence frigate Velmoras as cleanly as switching off a light. Life support remained on. Navigation remained on. Nothing dangerous. Everything else off. For 11 seconds, the Velmoras drifted in complete silence, dark from bow to stern, like a held breath. Then the Endurance switched it back on. Keen Vorith looked at his tactical officer. His tactical officer was looking at her console with the expression of someone whose instrument is telling them something that does not belong in their understanding of how the universe works. She said, very quietly, that pulse was precise enough to target individual system nodes. That isn't, sir. That's not possible from a vessel that size. On the Endurance's bridge, nobody moved. Nobody celebrated. Captain Osai was sitting in her chair with her hands folded and the expression of someone waiting patiently for the other party to finish thinking. At the back of the Armada's fleet formation, 3 ships had already begun, without orders, independently, because their own tactical crews were running the same numbers, drifting slowly backward. Keen Vorith asked for a 30-minute recess to consult with High Command. He opened the channel to High Command. He looked at his screen. He thought about what he had just watched. He thought about the voice on the other end, steady, unhurried, carrying the specific quality of a person who is not performing calm, but is simply, genuinely calm. He turned to his communications officer and said, in a voice he kept very controlled, "Get me everything we have on these people. Everything. Not the summary, the actual data." The file arrived in 4 minutes. He read for 20 seconds. He read a number, 46 billion, and he read another number, the fleet count, and he read about 16 planets, and he put the file down very carefully on his desk. He did not go back to high command. He opened the channel to the Endurance. "Captain," he said. "Admiral," she said. "I think we need to start over." The council chamber had not been this full in 300 years. Every seat was occupied. Delegates who had not attended a session in decades had traveled personally, because this was not something you could afford to miss, and not something you could afford to be seen missing. Hundreds of journalists, credentialed press from 40 star systems, packed the gallery above, because Velsareth's leaked data had now been independently confirmed, officially verified, and distributed across the Convergence's public information network so thoroughly that suppression was no longer a conversation anyone was having. The mood was difficult to name. Shame was close. So was panic. What it most resembled in the end was the specific discomfort of an individual who has said something very confidently at a very large table and been proven completely wrong in front of everyone multiplied by 400 civilizations. Velsareth stood at the speaker's platform. She was still a junior archivist. She had been suspended twice in the last 3 weeks, reinstated twice by emergency judicial orders filed by her legal advocates, and had not slept more than 4 hours in any given night during that period. She looked, in the words of one journalist who covered the session, like someone who has been on fire for a month and has decided to be fine with it. She spoke for 2 hours. She did not raise her voice once. She walked the council through every data point, every observation log, every extinction projection that had been quietly, repeatedly revised downward as humanity kept not going extinct. She showed them the rate of human technological advancement overlaid against the convergence average, a chart that produced, in the gallery, an audible silence which is the rarest and most significant kind. She showed them the fleet numbers, the planetary count. She showed them what Admiral Keen-Voreth had found when he read the actual file instead of the summary, and she quoted directly from his personal report to High Command, which someone had leaked to her that morning. She did not say who. She showed them the pulse demonstration on the Vel Moras, which had now been viewed 1.4 billion times across Convergence public networks. Then she said, quietly, that she would like the council to consider what they had actually done, not what they had intended, not the procedural justification, what they had, in practice, accomplished with Quarantine Protocol 7. They had taken a species in its infancy and removed every external resource, every possible shortcut, every elder civilization's accumulated wisdom, every piece of technology that might have been gifted, traded, or stolen. They had drawn a line and walked away. And that species had looked at the line, looked at the empty cosmos, and decided, with the specific stubbornness that apparently ran through humanity like a structural material, to build the entire galaxy themselves. You did not contain them, Velsareth said. You concentrated them. You removed every ceiling and wondered why they kept going up. The chamber was absolutely silent. Oreth spoke next. The Voreth delegate had not addressed the full council in 60 years, and when he rose, several older delegates straightened instinctively, the way very old habits reassert themselves. He did not speak long. He said that his people had maintained a predictive model of the Sol system since the quarantine was established. He said the model had been updated every century. He said the results had been consistent for the last 3 updates, and he had voted against the Boundary Enforcement Directive on that basis. He said he was not going to say he had told them so, because he was too old to find satisfaction in being right about something this important. He said, "You do not manage what you do not understand, and you do not understand them. You never did. I would recommend going forward that you try." He sat down. Marinsal attempted to speak. He was greeted with something that had no formal procedural name but functioned, in practice, as the council's version of looking away. The vote to formally terminate Quarantine Protocol 7 passed 389 to 23. The 23 who voted against were every one of them civilizations whose political identity had been built, in part, on the idea of convergent superiority over per-contact species. It was not a principled stand. It was wounded pride in formal dress. In the gallery, a journalist from the Voreth News Collective wrote in her notes, "They voted for it like they were confessing to something," which they were. Outside the chamber, 12 separate civilizations had already opened private diplomatic channels to Earth. The galaxy was learning something that Earth had known for 1,000 years. The universe does not wait for you to be ready. It simply moves on. And so, relentlessly, had humanity. The Earth delegation arrived at Convergence Hall on a Tuesday. There were 9 of them. They walked in single file through the great entrance hall, which was designed, deliberately, to make visitors feel small, with ceilings that rose 40 meters and walls carved with the names of every Convergence founding civilization in letters 3 meters tall. It had made delegations from a dozen proud civilizations feel appropriately humbled over the centuries. Captain Amara Osai, leading, looked up at the ceiling, looked at the walls, and said to the delegate beside her, in a voice she did not particularly lower, "Nice architecture. Ours is better." Then she walked forward. She was wearing her fleet uniform. She had been asked politely, through 3 separate diplomatic intermediaries, to consider civilian dress for the occasion, something less martial. She had considered it for approximately 4 seconds. Her response, diplomatic in phrasing, amounted to, "I earned this uniform. I'll keep it." The opening session lasted 6 hours. The Earth delegation was not there to apologize. They were not there to beg for membership, to prove their worthiness, or to express gratitude for being acknowledged. They were there, as their lead diplomat, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, stated in her opening remarks, to negotiate terms. They were prepared to join the Convergence as full members. They were not prepared to join it as junior members, provisional members, or members under observation. They had read the Convergence Charter carefully. They noted that the charter did not have a category for a civilization that had industrialized multiple star systems independently, without any external assistance. They suggested the council might want to create one. There was a long pause after this. Several delegates exchanged looks. Orith, sitting in his traditional seat in the Eastern Arc, made a sound that his longtime aide, the only being alive who could reliably interpret his expressions, later confirmed was laughter. The negotiations lasted 3 months. They were contentious, detailed, occasionally heated, and ultimately successful. Earth joined the Convergence not as a new member guided by senior partners, but as a peer. The specific language took 2 weeks to agree on. It was worth every argument. The changes came quickly after that, not because humanity arrived with demands, but because they arrived with questions, the kind of questions that civilizations stop asking once they've been comfortable for long enough. Why is this trade route structured this way? Who decided this medical protocol and when? Has anyone tried this approach to the Velen energy crisis? What if the underlying assumption in the Convergence's dark matter mapping model was wrong? The last one turned out to be correct. The underlying assumption had been wrong for 200 years. The Convergence's top astrophysicists had not caught it because they had all trained in the same tradition, used the same models, inherited the same intellectual frameworks from the same elder civilizations. A 26-year-old human physicist named Arjun Sharma caught it in a seminar during his first month at the Convergence Institute. Asked a question his professors found disrespectful in its simplicity, and turned out to be right. This became, in subsequent years, a pattern. The Joint Medical Research Initiative, Earth's first formal proposal to the Convergence, produced, within a decade, 12 treatments for conditions that Convergence medicine had classified as untreatable for centuries. Not because human medicine was more advanced, because human medicine had been built under entirely different pressures, against different constraints, and had arrived at solutions from angles that Convergent science had simply never explored. Velsarith was reassigned as Earth's official convergence liaison, a role that had not previously existed and was created specifically for her, partly as recognition of her contribution to the events of the past year, and partly because she was the only person in the building who had understood what was coming before it arrived, and had the specific combination of competence and stubbornness to do something about it. On her first day in the new office, Captain Osei stopped by unannounced. She put a small gift on the desk, a recording. Velsarith asked what it was. "The music from Appendix C," Osei said. "Don Vorith's original report, right? The piece she included and nobody read. We tracked down the original transcription. Our musicians performed it." She paused. "You should hear what it sounds like when it's actually played." Velsarith listened to it that evening, alone in the office. It was the Ninth Symphony, Beethoven, written by a man who was completely deaf at the time he composed it, who had never heard a single note of it, would never hear it, and wrote it anyway because the music existed in him and had to come out. She sat with that for a long time. The last thing that happened, small, easy to miss in the larger history of the period, was this. A crew of 3 humans on a routine survey mission near the old quarantine boundary located the original monitoring buoys. Old Don Vorith's fence, still floating, still functional in a dormant way. The Convergence had quietly decommissioned them 3 weeks after the Armada's withdrawal. The crew spent an afternoon at the primary buoy. When they left, there was a small titanium plaque attached to its hull, not official, not authorized, entirely in the tradition of things humans do when they have a feeling and an appropriate surface nearby. It read, "Thank you for the time alone." The buoy floated in the dark between stars, silent now as it had always been, but the silence was different. The silence of something that had done its job without meaning to, by failing at the only job it was given. Around it, the galaxy hummed with a civilization that had arrived. Not with apology, not with awe, but with 46 billion humans worth of ideas, questions, solutions, arguments, art, stubbornness, curiosity, and the particular impossible energy of a species that the universe had tried to ignore. The universe would not make that mistake again. And